Well, with that in mind, again, as Jonathan mentioned, my name is Dave Jennings. I'm what they call a technical principal program manager within Teams Engineering. My team and I work with a number of customers across a broader expansion of verticals. And really what our role is to make sure with the customers that we support, ensuring that they're set for success, not only on their core implementation of Teams, but how they scale that forward in terms of meetings, in terms of devices, could further extend into Teams rooms as an example, but in more broader as well on the topic we'll talk through today specific to Teams voice. And with that in mind, a couple of topics high level that we'll talk through is first, I'm going to kind of do a high level overview of the different voice scenarios that are available to you today and more broader what that means specifically within Teams. Second to that, we'll then take a little bit dive deeper into some of those different voice scenario options. For example, understanding the considerations of when you might deploy calling plans versus direct routing versus operator connect instead. We'll then talk through some of the other services that are available beyond just core voice enablement for a user. We use the term advanced voice scenarios, but this would include things like auto attendance call queues as an example. And we'll also talk through some of the planning aspects as that applies to Dynamic 911. So more than just the design supporting Teams voice, that's also a critical element that we have to account for. And then last but not least, we'll touch on the latest considerations and what that means for devices specifically. So with that in mind, to kind of set the foundation of what those different scenarios are available supporting Teams voice today. And again, we'll do a little bit deeper dive within these different capabilities further. But when you think about extending that deployment of Teams where you may be within your journey currently, the great thing is that you've got flexibility and choice, and we'll mention that a few different times, and how you can meet users where they are today with that extended capability of voice. And so some of the key scenarios that we'll talk through further is first and foremost, you have a native capability through what we call calling plans. And what's great about that is it's a very simple way to get up and running to extend voice capabilities through your Teams implementation. Second to that, there's also the capability through what we call operator and mobile connect. So what's great about that is if you've got existing telephony contracts that are in place for a particular carrier that further provides a more advanced but yet simple way to get up and running through Teams voice as well. And then thirdly, we've also got direct routing, which more broader extends where if the first two options aren't available for your specific requirements, that gives you even more further advance and more customization in how you can integrate those voice capabilities in the end. And as we look at that more broader and what that means from a global point of view, because obviously we know that customers equally could be in the mix with current corporate state, further consideration for any potential future merger acquisition activity, but also understanding those rest of world or headquarter locations that they may operate from today. And again, we'll go through each of these different options further, but the key takeaway with this slide, again, is you've got three different options that are available. You've got flexibility in which of those options you can deploy. The great thing is that there's not a hard and fast rule that says you have to deploy one service type over the other. Obviously, country locale requirements may influence that further, more broader compliance and regulatory considerations instead. But overall, we've got a really great story in terms of global coverage, depending on your specific corporate region or more locale site needs. With that in mind, I wanted to next talk through some of the specific considerations on how that further accrues to calling plans as a start. Now, to summarize at a high level, again, as I mentioned previously, the great thing about Teams Voice is that you've got that flexibility where You could leverage calling plans for all your users within your tenant, or you could mix match calling plans with one of the other telephony-based services instead. Again, thinking about Operator Connect or direct routing in that case. But for the focus on calling plans specifically, again, what's really an appealing option for many of our customers is that it allows them through the simplification of the Teams admin center. And again, we'll go through some other scenarios on how that compares to direct routing and Operator Connect to follow. But effectively allows customers to get up and running pretty quickly with assigning a user a given DID, and then further extending that based on the class of service that's desired. So as an example, when we talk about class of service, looking at does that user only require maybe a calling to their specific domestic locale? Do we need to further extend that to international coverage instead? And then the other thing that's great about that is that there are prepaid plans that you can purchase as an option. So the way that will work, and we'll talk here a little bit further, is those licenses that are signed to a user have a pre-allocated amount of minutes that are available per month. And so those will deprecate down based on the calls that are performed. Alternatively, there's also a pay-as-you-go calling plan based on specific country locales that can also be utilized as well. So again, more than just thinking about the different Teams voice service options are available, there's also additional flexibility within each instead. And so this gives a great opportunity as we think about calling plans in this case. To expand upon that a little bit further, so if you look from left to right, again, the first option that you have available is what we refer to as pay as you go. So that focus for that is from a domestic point of view. Again, there will be specific region or country restrictions that may apply, and that will be the case for which calling plan type you may consider. And again, you also have the flexibility where you can mix and match, but effectively, as indicated, the pay as you go basically allows you to accrue on a per minute basis when that license is assigned. Again, from a domestic point of view, what that reoccurring cost would be per month. Second to that, there's also another option, again, focused on domestic outbound calling equally, and that is the 120-minute plan. And so what differentiates here is that these are normally targeted for users that don't make a lot of calls. And so what's great about this is that when you assign a calling plan license, the minutes that are available across all licensed users will actually get pooled at the tenant level based on the country that those users are sourced from. And so where the 120-minute plan becomes a great option, again, there may be a mix for folks that maybe receive calls but don't make a lot of outbound calls, is it starts to provide a better balance where, again, because those minutes are pooled, where that license is assigned, meeting the right requirement on a reoccurring consideration. The other thing to note, and this will apply for the domestic plan and the international plan we'll talk through here briefly, is with those minutes that are pooled, that consumption and that renewal of the pooled minutes total will refresh on a reoccurring monthly basis instead. To extend that further, as we look at the domestic plan, that actually gives you more allocation of total minutes upfront. Again, the guidelines will differ based on the specific country where that user is located and licensed from. But the key here is that with the domestic plan, by default, you'll get 3,000 minutes per month that are allocated. Again, country specific versus maybe 1,200 minutes per month for other markets instead. Then as you finalize extending that out further is the consideration with the international plan as well. So the key here, again, is the pre-allocated minutes you get from an international point of view. And again, just like the domestic, where those licenses are assigned, where those users reside for a given country, those minutes in total will be pooled. Everyone shares from that pool as that minute count increments down, targeted for the overall usage for a given month. As an extension to that, there's also a second license type you can make use of, which is referred to as communication credits. And so normally where this will come into play is if you have toll-free dial-in requirement that you need to associate with audio conferencing. There could be some specific pay-as-you-go scenarios for certain countries that you need to support. And then also in the case of calling plans, that also provides for automated overage. Again, as you think about the different calling plan license you may be using, if in the event you have maybe a busy month where all the minutes are consumed, I can attest that the service is very accurate. So, if you need to have automated overage to be available, that's where that communication credit license will come into play instead. So now that we've kind of talked through the high-level considerations for calling plans, I wanted to talk through next the second option that's available with specific to direct routing in this case. So what's unique for direct routing, again, it's a second option that's available to you that you can deploy on its own, or as I mentioned earlier, you can deploy in part of users that are licensed for calling plans or Operator Connect instead. But the great thing about direct routing is, in this case, is it gives you more advanced flexibility where you can deploy what we call a certified session border controller. So this is, think of it as a firewalled voice gateway of sorts, where not only would you integrate this to terminate voice supporting users in Teams, but it also gives you greater flexibility where you can integrate that same gateway with existing maybe phone systems that you have on premise today. Maybe there's a requirement where you need to further extend the ROI, overall life investment of that implementation, or it can also provide greater flexibility if we've got specific analog devices that aren't able to directly be supported through Teams and/or other third-party voice applications instead. And again, the great thing about this is you've got flexibility on how you can architect those designs. There is a core reference as it applies to Teams specifically, but depending on the SBC vendor you deploy forward with, there will also be additional considerations from their side that you'll need to account for as well. And the great thing about the option through direct routing is we have a number of partners we work very closely with that have certified their solutions, and this list is continuing to grow. So the key here is that, again, further flexibility and choice depending on what type of SBC vendor or model you may have in place today. And then further to that, you've also got additional options available, whether those SBC instances are physical versus virtual, and how that may extend forward, maybe a mix between the two, supporting your design in the end. To kind of summarize high level how that direct routing implementation would come together. So the first thing to note, first and foremost, is you would need to deploy a certified SBC from our list of devices that have been validated for Teams. So that would be the first step. Second to that, there's some technical readiness considerations you'll also have to account for. For example, each SBC that you deploy has to have its own public unique DNS name that points to that SBC. Second to that, each SBC would also need its own properly firewalled public IP address. And then thirdly, each SBC will need its own certificate associated to that SBC. There's some flexibility there where you could use a certificate that's requested as a one-to-many, where you could support multiple SBCs at once, or you could be more restrictive with certificate where it's only a specific name of SBCs instead, or you can also make use of a one-to-one mapping for certificate if needed instead. So again, flexibility there on the requirements that work best for your organization. But the key there is that's the core construct for getting the foundational elements of direct routing in place. Also important to note, there may be specific license considerations for the SBC vendor that you have to account for. Common things that come to mind could be the total number of concurrent sessions we expect that SBC to support. That could also include advanced monitoring or routing capability. Some third-party vendors have their additional offerings that they can enhance into that. And then thirdly, it could be the case where we'll talk here a little bit further, scenarios around media bypass that allows for further optimization in how that SBC is used. That could have requirement for additional licensing as well. And then separate to that are the licensing considerations from the Microsoft point of view. So the key here is that the user in the context of Teams would need to have the right E or F license assigned in this case. Further, that would need to include ensuring that the phone system license is enabled. And then separately, they would either leverage the native Teams client, that could be through desktop, browser, or on a mobile phone, or even a physical phone device if required. And or, the type of hardware device as appropriate instead. So think about the case where you've got an isolated physical phone that sits on a desk instead. Then the last component to this is the telephony trunk from the carrier side. So again, flexibility and choice could be traditional telephony integration, could be SIP-based instead. It really just depends on what that carrier provides and then what integration options are available with the SBC that you choose to deploy. The last thing that I'll just note too, in consideration, is that when we architected Teams with this direct routing capability, we actually did a lot of planned architecture work up front so that as long as you have a good internet connection, meeting the requirements for Teams, that will be supportable enough for extending for voice in that case. However, we also recognize that there may be certain requirements where, as a customer, you may be highly regulated or there's additional governance compliance elements that you have to account for instead. And because of that, we also support routing that voice traffic to be isolated but dedicated through express route connectivity if required. So again, additional options are available, more further flexibility as you think about, broader mapping out your notional direct routing design. As an extension to that, when considering to deploy direct routing, there's also a few decisions you'll have to think about in terms of how you'll allow for media traffic in that case. And so the first thing to note is by default, when you deploy direct routing, the way that media traffic will flow is it will egress out of your organization through the public firewall via the internet to the Teams service and back. So that would be the default route in terms of how traffic is processed for voice in that case. As an option to that, you can further plan to optimize that traffic flow by reducing the number of hops required through what we call enabling media bypass instead. So the difference there with that second option is instead of the media traffic having to route external via the internet up to the cloud service and back, alternatively, it'll still have to route out your public firewall, but it'll directly hairpin back in, connecting to the external interface of your SBC instead. So the key there is that we're reducing the number of hops and processing points required, again, to provide a more direct connection to support additional optimized scenarios where required. And so where that could be helpful is in the case where you've got a number of remote sites that are flowing up through maybe a regional site, and because of that, you have a requirement to reduce the number of hops involved. And then as an additional extension to that, we also provide extensibility where you could also implement direct routing for supporting sites where maybe that remote site doesn't have internet connectivity in that case. And so the way that would come together is through your configuration, you would designate a proxy SBC. So this would be usually a data center that's close in region, could be close in country. And then effectively for all calls placed and received, the external calls will route locally to the site. For the site itself, the Teams client will establish media to the local SBC. And then for the stream going to Teams, that will be routed through your WAN through your regional hub or data center, which then will egress that to the service for your site instead. So again, the key here, there's not a hard and fast rule that says you have to deploy one type of architecture globally versus the other. Again, additional flexibility in terms of choice, meeting your specific organizational or site needs. And then last but not least, there's also the flexibility where you can make use of, independent of which architecture you choose to deploy for direct routing, additional controls to support location-based routing scenarios instead. And so key where this often comes up is where for a given country, rest of world, where there's a regulatory requirement that specifically mandates how that PSTN traffic needs to flow both outbound and inbound. So at this point, with having kind of talked through the high-level overview of options available for Teams Voice, taking a little bit dive deeper in terms of what's available for calling plans, further what that means and how you can extend that forward for direct routing, I wanted to talk to next some of the different options that are also available from what we call an Operator Connect perspective instead. And so to kind of summarize the Operator Connect offering at a high level is through the Teams Admin Center today, I think there's roughly 97 different carriers that are available. You can actually choose to turn up net new service directly within the tenant. You can choose to reuse or bring across leveraging a telco partner carrier that maybe you're using today. And again, the great thing about this is that by leveraging this Operator Connect option, it's really just voice as a service terminating directly into your tenant where they manage the infrastructure, they manage all the routing of calls, and it's really just a seamless extension, but providing more advanced functionality for voice services within Teams in this case. And then the other thing that's important to note is some offerings may vary by partner vendor type. As an example, some operators may only focus on domestic versus others that are international, or maybe a mix between the two. And then some other things that may differentiate is the additional reporting, monitoring, and support that those specific providers may provide instead. In addition to just the core voice capability for Operator Connect, there's also an option when how either dedicated or as part of your end user voice service, where you can extend additional dialing coverage capability for audio conferencing as well. And so again, the key here is that this gives you additional options available to you, where if you didn't want to go through managing your numbers that terminate for audio conferencing, or maybe you want to bring in a toll-free number or numbers as such, the key here is you have flexibility where you could leverage Operator Connect to directly provide that service capability instead. And so again, as part of that common theme here, different options available, again, additional flexibility in terms of choice, and based on which voice technology you deploy. Again, you could do all or a mix of in between, and then further within the technology type, different options that are available to you as well. The last thing that I'll touch on too, then from an Operator Connect point of view, is the recent extensibility we've now included for Teams Phone Mobile in this case. And so what's further great about this in alignment with that Operator Connect model is that for the phone number that terminates to your mobile phone device, or from a SIM enabled perspective, if it's one of the carriers listed today, there's currently 6 of these, and we've got, I think, 4 more planned for later this year. You can actually leverage that existing number, or you can take on a new number instead. And that effectively becomes your single number reach, not only for your mobile phone, but also for direct termination into Teams as well. And so what's great about that is because it is natively integrated into Teams, that also includes shared integration. So for example, if I take a call on my mobile phone, I reflect that present status for other users through their Teams desktop client. How I interact with call history, access to voicemail services, even transferring of calls, etc. Again, it's really simplifying the management required, and further giving that greater extensibility for that mobile device. And then what's great about that further is because it is natively integrated in Teams, you have flexibility to switch back and forth, based on your specific needs. So again, just another option that is available to you. The thing to note is that if you do have users that are enabled for Teams Phone mobile, that has to be their main telephony option, whereas some of the other considerations with calling plans, direct routing as an example, you could actually have a user enabled for both instead. So as an example, we've seen some cases where maybe a user is enabled for calling plans as their main calling capability, but then as a fallback, they could be enabled for direct routing in that case, or even if it's for dialing certain numbers that are that are international, out of the domestic locale instead. The final element then I'll touch on in summary then for Operator Connect is also the recent capability we've also brought about in terms for users located within India. And so the key here is following that same Operator Connect model, we have 3 initial partners that we're working with directly. In terms of the offerings they available for India specifically, again, along with support in those advanced service management differentiators. The great thing about this is that each of these carriers have solutions that are certified based on the user type. And we see this as a very common ask, especially for companies that may have a user populace that is maybe headquartered out of the US, maybe it's rest of the world, or they've got a really large targeted population within India instead. And so the great thing here is it's now more simplified with these partners, being able to ensure that through integration of Teams, you're able to more simply deploy that voice capability, but also ensuring that you're properly aligned from a client's perspective as well. So at this point, again, kind of talk through the high-level overview, and again, the different voice options that are available for Teams Voice. I wanted to briefly touch on next some of the other considerations from a dynamic 911 planning perspective instead. So to kind of set the foundation at a high level for Teams Voice, as you plan out your deployment for a given site or sites, and this actually applies to any phone system net new going forward instead. There were a few different regulation laws that were passed a couple years back that really dictates around Kerry's Law and Raybom's Act, which means that when a 911 call is placed, you have to ensure that there's the right notification. Second to that, you need to provide the most accurate location possible of where that call is being placed from. And then thirdly, there shouldn't be any blocking in terms of dial plans. So think about pressing 9 for an access to an outside light as an example. Users should be able to just dial 911 and then directly have that call routed out. So the good news is as you're planning the core architecture for the voice service, supporting Teams Voice in this case, there will be some additional planning that you'll have to account for in order to properly populate, I'll use the term location service database, such that if an emergency call is placed, we can rest assured that the most accurate location is provided so that the emergency response are able to be efficiently and quickly be coordinated most appropriately. The way that configuration will come together high level, really focused on the 4 blue boxes that you see at the top. Starting at the left is it really starts with what we call trusted IP addresses. And so what this means specifically is what are those public facing IP address segments from a Teams client point of view as seen by the Teams service itself. So as an example, if I'm on a corporate location I launch my Teams client, what is the public IP address and or more broader IP subnet space that this service would see from that client point of view in that case. So that's the first step. And the reason that that's a requirement is that that's kind of step one in how we identify when an endpoint is connecting from a designated corporate location or not. Second to that then are going to be the actual location database details themselves. And so where this will start is you'll have to populate the physical emergency address for the different locations where users using Teams Voice will be located or deployed. When you define those addresses, you'll additionally need to provide the associated geo coordinates as well. Again, that's also part of the new dynamic 911 legislation requirement. And then further, depending on how accurate you have to provide that dynamic 911 location, again, it will really align to your corporate and legal team to advise on what that requirement needs to be in terms of being met. But the key there is more than just the core physical address. There's also flexibility where you can denote buildings, floor within the building, or room within a floor instead. So again, the key there, flexibility is fully available depending from a core location perspective, how accurate we need to provide that reference. Supporting that, once that core location is defined, you'll next identify how those locations are matched. And so the options we have available to us is we can match on subnet, we can match on, if it's an Ethernet connection, MAC address of a given LAN switch, MAC address of a port on a LAN switch, and or we can match based on the access point in terms of BSS ID that endpoint is connected to instead. So the key there, you can define all those elements, a mix or exclusive instead. But the key there is that will be the core element that the Teams client will match on compared to with confirming the trusted IP, again, public internet facing IP address in this case, to tell the Teams service where that endpoint is at for any given time. So those in summary are the two first components as part of that location database element. The third aspect of this then is the policy considerations for dynamic calling as well. That's going to accrue from two aspects. The first one talks to the Teams calling policy. So what you designate there is you've got an option. I think I've got a few screenshots I'll show here in a second, but you've got an option for a warning banner that will appear every time users launch the Teams client. For example, confirm your current emergency address location as an example. The second thing that calling policy also denotes is that if an emergency call is placed, who and how do you want the appropriate persons to be notified? So as an example, you can leverage a particular person, you can leverage a specific group, and then further you can say those persons only get notified via an important high priority message in Teams, or in addition, you can have Teams automatically conference those persons into the emergency call instead. And you've got further flexibility where you can have those users be muted or unmuted instead. So again, those are some of the different settings that you'll want to think about from the emergency calling perspective in that case. Second to that, and this applies to direct routing specifically, is you have to identify when someone dials 911, where does that emergency call route? And the reason for that, and I'll talk through further here in a second, unlike calling plans as an example, or Operator Connect, where either Microsoft or the partner carrier may provide that emergency service provider service for you. So basically it's your integration to what we call a PSAP, public service answering point, that gets the address details when an emergency call is placed. For direct routing, you have to further account for deploying your own emergency service routing provider trunk connection instead. So when we talk about emergency service routing providers, this would be for an example, Intrado, bandwidth, IntelliQuint as an example instead. So in order to denote when to route those calls to that dedicated trunk, again, just for the purpose of emergency calling, that's where that additional policy is required to one, identify when that number is dialed, which SBC, and then further which trunk those emergency details are passed through. The other thing that that second policy will allow for is what we call emergency dialing mask support if required. So the key there, if you have, say, for example, persons from another region or country that happen to visit your local site and say, for example, they're used to dialing 112 in the case of an emergency, you can actually set up a translation number that will auto convert that to 911. So if they happen to forget, the number they need to dial for an emergency in the U.S., will automatically account for that instead. That can also support the case. We know that in certain verticals, like manufacturing, as an example, there may be like an internal security notification or answering point that needs to be notified first instead. So again, through that mask manipulation, that could be another option that is leveraged there as well. The last element to this, then, once we've got our network details, our location database, and our policy elements defined, we now then can extend to how we would assign those configuration elements holistically. And again, this is optional at a region level, at a site level, or on a per subnet perspective instead. And so where that would further come into play is if in the event you had someone that was visiting a remote site and they happened to place an emergency call, that allows you to ensure that the right persons for that remote site get notified versus the person that's visiting home site, designated contacts being notified instead. So again, additional flexibility available based upon those specific dynamic routing calling needs. To touch a little bit further then, from the foundational elements we have to account for, again, there's different options available on how you can further extend that location database as needed. And so important to note is that although there is an initial configuration that will happen up front, equally important is making sure that you've got the right change control processes in place as your corporate environment may scale over time. Or in the case, as an example, say we've got locations matched to an access point or a particular switch, and if that hardware gets replaced, we have to make sure as a follow-up action that we go back and we update the location database appropriately instead. For direct routing specifically, as a second consideration here, again, focus for emergency calling in this case, is there is an additional consideration you'll have to account for in terms of emergency routing service, and it will have to be one of the three vendors here that you see shown. So again, the key here, unlike calling plans and operator connect, where this service is automatically provided for you, for direct routing specifically, this will be deployed as a separate trunk interface, usually within your SBC. And so when an emergency call is placed, those location details will be sent out in parallel to that dedicated trunk so that when that emergency call is received, we've got the person placing the call directly available, and then equally associated to that, the location details from where that call is coming from. In support of that, there's also a few additional elements that you can make use of as well. So the last two slides that we talked through really iterated through how we would configure the core foundations for dynamic calling. But what about in the case if I have someone who's working from home, or maybe they're on the go and they need to place an emergency call instead? So the great thing is with Teams today, the client will actually, unless this is turned off by policy, the client will actually interact with the operating system. So think about Windows versus Mac, even for mobile phones in this case, to determine what your approximate physical location is at a given time. And so the way that works is Within your tenant, there's actually an Azure Map API service that is directly available. And there's actually a service that runs within the operating system, again, applies to Windows, Mac, and even mobile devices, where when the Teams client is launched, that service will confirm your public IP address at that time. It will do a cross correlation to an approximate physical address that will include geo coordinates, and that's what will first populate in terms of where the service thinks you're at. Now, if that address is correct, you can just confirm that that is the case. Or if the address is incorrect or you need to manually specify that instead, that is an option as well. The consideration there, however, is if we auto match your address and you confirm that, if you place an emergency call, your call would get routed to the public service answering point most closest to you. If, however, you manually update that address instead, and again, there could be a few reasons, requirements for that, what will happen differently is when you place an emergency call, you'll go to a national screening center first because we don't really have a way to confirm you are where you say you're calling from. So you'll first validate your location, and then after that point, you'll get rerouted to the closest supporting PSAP instead. So again, there's a few things in consideration as we think about end user readiness, once they're ready to broader consume Teams voice. In support of that, as I kind of mentioned earlier, through the different policy settings available to you, you do have an emergency disclaimer message that you can also define as well. I think you're limited up to 150 characters, but effectively every time the user launches the Teams client, this is the banner that they will see. And then lastly, if in the event that an emergency call is placed, this gives you kind of a high-level view from both the end user placing the call as well as from the security desk as an example that's notified, where on the left and the upper right, you can see that Teams denotes that this is an emergency call that's in place. It'll show your assigned phone number as well as the detected location that the service has identified you're calling from. And then the lower right, this gives you an example of what the notification would look like. Again, the designated security for a given site as an example that this particular user from this location has placed an emergency call. And again, based on policy, you could also be auto-conferenced in to help with coordination response for that emergency call as well. And then lastly, it's a very similar consideration as we think about physical phone devices equally in this case. So this could be phones that are in a conference room, as an example, could either extend to Teams meeting rooms in this case, and/or specific phones that sit on a person's desk instead. So again, same concept, rules apply. Just note that the same experience will result where your number will be identified, and then you can also see the location details that were sent to the emergency response point at that point once that call has been placed. So now that we've kind of talked through, again, the latest service considerations for Teams Voice, and again, some of the broader elements we additionally have to account for from an emergency calling point of view, I wanted to next talk briefly on some of the other advanced scenarios that you can make use of as well that are natively available as part of your Teams Voice enablement. To summarize at a high level, you've got two core services that are further available to you that you can either deploy globally and/or for a set of specific regional or designated sites. The two services at a high level are first, one we refer to as Auto Attendant. So this is a voice-enabled application where you can associate a local number or a toll-free number where when called externally, users will hear an opening greeting. You can provide options in how the user can interact. So for example, press 1 for sales as an example, and/or you can further provide flexibility to have access to directory to search for persons in your organization or dial by name instead. Second to that, We also have the capability that we can make use of called call queues as well that provides a simple, light type of experience, meeting some of those traditional hunt group and or more simpler call center type scenarios instead. And so in that second scenario, again, it would allow you to leverage a local number or toll-free number instead, where if called, you could have, again, a menu that's played, and then you can determine what actions are taken once that message is heard, and then how you want those calls to be routed to agents that are available within the queue to support that call to follow. Now, the thing to note is for the call queue specifically, we support up to 200 agents today. But the great thing is between these two services is you can deploy them independently. You can mix and match the two together. We do see that quite often. And you can further nest within themselves within a particular service instead. So as an example, I could have a main auto attendant that nests to a second auto attendant based on a DTMF option that was selected. Say press 1 for sales as an example. Equally, instead of going to a secondary auto attendant when they press 1 for sales, I could have them transfer it to the call queue supporting sales instead. So again, these services are available by default and a lot of different options in terms of flexibility and how the services can be architected and deployed. Equally important to note, just like the technical readiness considerations we had to account for teams of voice in general, is there are some elements you'll have to consider for auto attendants and call queues in terms of preparation equally. Key to that is you'll have to provision what's called a resource account. Basically, it is a disabled object within Azure, but it is the minimum object required to associate either an auto attendant or a call queue to. Second to that, it is that same object identity that we'll use for phone number assignment, which really brings all those elements together such that when that number is dialed externally, the service knows which service, auto attendant or call queue, and then specifically which instance of those services to route that call to instead. And then equally important are the considerations from an agent perspective as well. And so the key here is that agents will have a requirement to be voice enabled because they are processing inbound calls in this case. And then secondly, you'll need to take consideration in terms of which endpoint those agents are using to ensure that they're using a supported endpoint supporting that particular scenario instead. So think about Teams desktop client versus a physical phone versus a mobile client, on a normal cellular phone as an example instead. As an extension to that, so we support call queue as a service natively through Teams. However, there are different options that you can also leverage to enhance that experience, meeting users where they are today in Teams to support that capability as well. And one of the first options for that that you can leverage today is specific to what we call voice-enabled channels. And so what's great about this is that you can actually leverage a channel within a team where you can associate that call queue to, where at a glance, all agents can see status of the other agents. They can see who's active in a call or not, and then they can also directly sign into the call queue or not instead. Also, what's great about this is you have a simplified view in terms of call history for the calls that, as an agent, you've processed as well, and further direct access to voicemail supporting the call queue as appropriate. So this is an option directly available to you that you can make use of today. As an extension to that, very soon at around I think we're tracking towards October timeframe of this year, we'll have an additional option that you can also take use of, which is referred to the new Queues app in this case instead. And so what this will do is further extend the core call queue in that voice-enabled channel experience where you'll be able to directly leverage the more detailed status of the call queue itself. As a supervisor, you'll be able to see how your agents are performing. Further, if there's requirements where you need to do like a direct assist, a whisper, barge in, take over, that type of thing, all those functionalities will be available to you as well. Second to that, from a supervisor point of view, holistically, you'll now have greater flexibility how you can see those services are performing, across your environment. And so the great thing is, once this is fully released, you'll now have additional options where you can designate for a given site who has access to view, manage a particular auto tenant or call queue, and then more broader what that means in terms of from the different monitoring aspects as well. And so what's further great to this is there will be real-time statistics that are available, as well as historical that will follow. And then lastly, as I kind of mentioned earlier, some of those direct capabilities that you can now will be able to enhance as part of that new queue app experience as well. And so again, the key here is how you can more directly support your agents as part of that overall call queue experience. Now, the one thing to note, once this is available in Teams, this does have an additional licensing requirement where if the agents are looking to make use of this app, they will have to be licensed for Teams Premium. Additionally, if as a supervisor, you're looking to make use of the more advanced management capabilities instead, those supervisors will have to be licensed for Team Premium as well. So again, the key there is you can license both, you can license one or the other, but the impact consideration there is that if the user doesn't have Teams Premium, they won't have access to the new queue app experience. They would only be able to interact as part of the default call queue experience instead. The last thing I'll note then, just along those lines, for that forthcoming call queue capability is a lot of the recent generative AI integration we've recently made available for Copilot as well. And so what's great about this is whether from a core Teams phone perspective or more as the role of an agent within a call queue, being able to directly interact, getting more succinct insights during the call, after the call, further easily referencing that as maybe the update for that call, where that is all now seamlessly integrated instead. So again, the key here is lots of flexibility in how you look to manage and scale that experience. The last thing then I'll just touch on briefly are just at this point, having talked through the different voice service options available, some of the additional planning elements as we think about direct routing, calling plans, operator connect, further the emergency calling aspects we need to consider. And most recently, some of the advanced voice scenarios opportunities available. I wanted to just close out briefly then on some of the device aspects instead. And so the key here is you think about how you are looking to either formalize or scale your current deployment of Teams Voice today. Equally important is the persona considerations to map to what type of device and how those devices will be utilized either from an individual perspective. So think about like a information worker, boss admin type of scenario versus what that means in terms of group workspaces instead. So the key there in that latter reference is looking at areas that are like huddle rooms, focus rooms, small, medium, large meeting rooms in that case. The great thing is out of those two persona groups, again, you have flexibility. Could be one or the other or a mix of in between where you think about USB type peripherals, what that means in terms of a typical endpoint, whether that's a workstation, a laptop, a mobile device, and or a physical Teams phone, or in the work group space, even more broader as we think about conference rooms, Teams room phones, and or Surface Hub instead. And then finally, just for further consideration is there's also a service also directly available to you as part of that Teams Voice enablement, which is SIP Gateway in this case. And what's really great with this service is it provides a core calling capability, allowing you to get additional reuse for maybe some of the device inventory that you have in your environment today where you can further extend that ROI, providing a lot of those core capabilities with Teams voice in this case. And with that, Jonathan, I think that was my last slide.
Amazing, Dave. Thanks so much. We have a few questions I think we're able to get to. On direct routing by pass, what are the range of media port UDP that are in use between the client and the SBC? I think I can find that information and we'll post it.
Yeah.
And another one, when making an outbound call via direct routing, the initial ringback that the users hear is the Microsoft ringback, which then changes to a standard carrier ringback. Can we change that ringback?
Yeah, the ringback in that case most often isn't configurable, but there may be in some cases where either the carrier or the SBC vendor can provide an option to help you optimize for that instead. But typically, it's not configurable.
And another question: any major implications between mixing environments between direct routing, operator connect, and calling plans? No, not really, right? No majors.
That's correct. Just the main thing you'll want to account for is that for calling plans and operator connect specifically, depending on the region or the country that and the regulatory requirement, that may influence which option that you proceed forward with. But the good news is that there's still flexibility there where you can mix across all three technologies with no issue.
All right, perfect. Wow, amazing. I am, let's see if we've got any last ones. Nestor asks, when Microsoft Teams Phone solutions support and multi-administrator requirement, is there a subtenant or location grouping capability in Teams Phone? Subtenant administrators can only manage support stations. I think we've refined that, right? I thought we refined administrative roles in Teams. I think that would have come.
Yes, so this is a question that does come up often. I believe later this year, as part of roadmap, we are looking at our first foray to enhance with administrative unit support. So more than just the RBAC roles available today, you'll be able to be more prescriptive on what those management capabilities look like for a given site, group of users instead.
Awesome. Well,